November 18, 1944, a shattered village outside the German border, Western Europe. The fog came in low and heavy, clinging to broken stone and wet earth like a second skin. It muffled sound, bent distance, and turned movement into rumor. Somewhere beyond the ruins, boots scraped against rubble. Metal clicked softly. A line of German infantry advanced with the confidence of men who believed the fight was already decided. They had reason to believe it. By late 1944, this part of the front had become predictable. American units were stretched thin, rotating replacements into positions that barely resembled villages anymore. Roofs were gone. Walls were hollowed out by artillery. Streets were choked with brick dust and splintered beams. The Germans had seen it all before. They expected rifles. They expected a burst or two of automatic fire, then silence. They expected the Americans to fall back. They did not expect what waited behind a collapsed stone wall at the edge of the square. The weapon in the American soldiers' hands looked wrong for the moment. It was squat and crude, its metal dull and unfinished. It had no graceful curves, no polished wood. It looked like something made in a factory that had been told to hurry. The M3 submachine gun had earned a nickname among its own users long before it ever reached this village. Grease gun, not because it was sleek or powerful, but because it looked like a mechanic's tool that had wandered onto a battlefield by mistake. Many soldiers disliked it. Some distrusted it. Others laughed at it. The Germans had laughed too, the first time they encountered one. A slow-firing American submachine gun made of stamped steel did not belong in a war of tanks and artillery. It did not sound threatening. Its hollow clatter lacked the sharp authority of other automatic weapons. On paper, it was inferior. In the hands of a man pressed against cold stone, it was something else entirely. The patrol had been moving cautiously through the ruins at first light. 5 Americans, soaked through, boots heavy with mud. They were not looking for a fight. They were looking for a rout. Instead, the rout collapsed behind them when the first German rifle cracked through the fog. Then another. Then a burst of automatic fire stitched the wall above their heads. They were pinned. The square offered no cover beyond what remained of a bakery and a low wall that had once bordered a garden. Smoke drifted in lazy curls from somewhere deeper in the village. The air smelled of wet ash and brick dust. Every second stretched. Every sound carried too far. The German infantry advanced carefully now, spreading out, using doorways and craters. They had the numbers. They had the angle. It was a textbook situation. The Americans were supposed to break. The man with the grease gun waited. He did not raise the weapon immediately. He listened. He counted footsteps. He felt the cold metal press into his palms. The gun was heavier than it looked, awkward in its balance. He had cursed it before. He had called it unreliable. In training, it had jammed more than once. But it was what he had been issued, and it was what he had now. The first German silhouette appeared through the fog, close enough to make out the shape of a helmet. The grease gun barked. The sound was wrong. It was not fast. It was not dramatic. It was steady. Each round left the barrel with a dull mechanical certainty. Not a scream, but a pulse. The first burst dropped the lead man. The second burst forced the others flat. The Germans paused. Then they moved again. The grease gun did not stop. The firing continued without the expected break. No pause. No frantic reload. Just the same hollow rhythm, uninterrupted, beating against the fog. To the Germans, it sounded like a weapon that did not need to breathe. This was the moment when assumptions began to crack. German doctrine taught them to listen. Automatic fire revealed position, strength, and intent. A single submachine gun announced itself quickly, then fell silent as the shooter reloaded. A machine gun announced itself with authority and volume. This sound was neither. It sat in between, relentless, controlled, and confusing. A German officer shouted orders. The squad pulled back behind cover. They waited for the fire to slacken. It did not. Behind the wall, the American gunner twisted his wrist. The weapon dipped for a fraction of a second, then came back up. The sound resumed instantly. What the Germans could not see was the crude solution taped beneath the receiver. 3 magazines bound together, aligned just well enough to feed. When one ran dry, the next was already waiting. There was no reload, only motion. The illusion was complete. Before we go any further, pause here for a moment. Stories like this do not survive unless people choose to carry them forward. If you value the forgotten details of World War II, consider subscribing to WW2 Frontline Legends, and let us know in the comments where you are watching from around the world. These stories belong to all of us. The Germans tried again, probing from another angle. The fog betrayed them. The grease gun answered each movement with the same calm rhythm. The sound echoed off stone and broken walls, multiplying itself. It felt larger than it was. It felt deliberate. Reports would later claim the Americans had set up a machine gun nest in the square. Others would insist there were multiple automatic weapons firing in coordination. None of those reports mentioned a single man crouched behind a garden wall with a weapon most armies considered second-rate. Minutes stretched into something longer. The German advance stalled, not because of casualties alone, but because the situation no longer made sense. The Americans were supposed to be outgunned. The firing pattern suggested otherwise. Commanders hesitated. Hesitation spread. When the Germans finally pulled back to reassess, the fog closed in again, swallowing the square. The Americans did not pursue. They did not need to. The space between belief and reality had already done the work. The grease gun fell silent at last. Not because the enemy had withdrawn, but because the third magazine was empty. The gunner lowered the weapon and listened to his own breathing. It sounded loud in the sudden quiet. Somewhere nearby, a loose shutter tapped against stone. At that moment, no one on either side understood what had just happened. The Americans believed they had bought time. The Germans believed they had encountered something new. Both were wrong. What had been unleashed in that ruined village was not a weapon, but a story. And stories, once born in war, have a way of traveling faster than the truth. The fog began to lift, and somewhere beyond the square, German radios crackled to life, carrying the first confused reports of a fire that would not stop, a sound that did not fade, and an American position that felt impossibly strong. They would soon give it a name, and the name would outlive the gun. The first reports reached German command posts before noon, carried by runners and clipped radio transmissions that disagreed with one another in ways that mattered. One squad claimed they had encountered at least 2 American automatic weapons covering the square. Another insisted the firing came from only one direction but never paused. A third report described the sound itself as unnatural, steady in a way that suggested mechanical certainty rather than human rhythm. Officers compared notes and frowned. None of it lined up. By doctrine, an American patrol pinned in a ruined village should have gone quiet after the first exchange. Ammunition was finite. Nerves were not. Yet the sound described in every account was the same. A hollow, repeating pulse that returned instantly each time it seemed about to end. German infantry pushed again from a different approach, testing the edges of the village. They advanced through doorways and shattered windows, expecting to draw fire from new angles. Instead, the same sound met them. Same tempo. Same calm indifference to their movement. It was as if the Americans were waiting for them everywhere at once. What they did not know was that the American patrol had not moved at all. Behind the collapsed wall, the gunner stayed low, rotating the weapon only when he had to. Each twist of his wrist was practiced now. The taped magazines were not elegant. They shifted slightly with each movement, threatening to misalign. He compensated by feel alone, pressing his thumb against the metal, keeping the feed steady. It was a crude system, born of boredom and desperation long before this morning. It was never meant to last. It did not have to. The Germans broke contact again, this time more cautiously. They pulled back farther than before, beyond the square, beyond the bakery. They regrouped and argued. The position had become expensive, not in casualties, but in uncertainty. No one liked fighting what they could not identify. This was the moment when fear began to outrun fact. A field officer radioed his superior and described the engagement as encountering sustained automatic fire of unknown type. He suggested the Americans had brought up heavier weapons during the fog. Another officer countered that no movement had been observed. Both agreed on one thing. Whatever was firing did not behave like a single man. It was here that the illusion hardened into belief. Before the next push, take a breath and consider this. War is often decided not by what is true, but by what is believed. If stories like this matter to you, take a moment to subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from. These moments shaped the war long before anyone wrote them down. The Germans attempted suppression next. Mortar rounds fell short, then long, shattering more stone and filling the air with fresh dust. The square became unrecognizable. Through it all, the grease gun answered movement, not bombardment. It did not challenge the mortars. It waited. When a helmet appeared, it spoke again. German troops began to avoid the sound. They maneuvered wider now, probing the flanks, looking for the edges of what they believed was a defensive network. Each attempt ended the same way. The sound returned unbroken, as if the Americans had anticipated every move. This was the first turning point, though no one named it yet. Later, German after-action summaries would describe the engagement as an American defensive position supported by multiple automatic weapons firing in coordination. Some even speculated about a new variant of submachine gun with extended capacity. The language shifted subtly from confusion to explanation, because explanation felt safer. The truth was simpler and far more fragile. There was never more than one gun. The entire illusion rested on timing, discipline, and a few inches of tape steel. The pauses that should have given the Germans confidence never came. The seconds they were trained to count never appeared. In their absence, imagination filled the gap. This is where the story bends. Because the Germans did not retreat in panic. They withdrew deliberately, convinced they had encountered something worth avoiding until heavier forces could be brought up. In doing so, they ceded ground to 5 Americans who should not have held it at all. If this moment surprises you, stay with the story. And if you believe the smallest details can change the course of a fight, consider subscribing to WW2 Frontline Legends. These are the moments history rarely explains. The American patrol used the withdrawal to slip away through a gap that had not existed an hour earlier. The gunner fired only when necessary now, conserving what little advantage remained. The third magazine emptied as they moved, the sound finally stopping for good. Silence settled over the village like a held breath. The Germans returned cautiously, advancing into empty streets. They found no machine gun, no network of positions, no evidence of the force they believed had been there. Only spent casings and shattered stone. The absence unsettled them more than resistance had. Somewhere in the confusion, a report was filed using a phrase no one could later attribute to a single voice. Endless storm. It described the fire not by its volume, but by its refusal to end. The phrase traveled. Days later, miles away, a different German unit encountered sudden, sustained automatic fire during a night probe. It lasted only moments, but long enough to feel familiar. The men involved had heard the stories. They withdrew sooner than they otherwise would have. And that is when the second layer of the illusion formed. Pause again. If you are seeing how fear moves faster than facts, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and share where you are watching from. These stories connect across borders, just like the rumors did. The American gunner never knew any of this. By the time the patrol reached friendly lines, the grease gun was already failing. The heat of repeated firing had warped the thin receiver. Grit had worked its way into places no field cleaning could reach. When the weapon finally jammed for good during a later withdrawal, it was abandoned without ceremony. No one marked the spot. The gun lay buried beneath rubble, silent and useless. Its part in the fight was over. The story, however, was only beginning. German intelligence intercepted chatter referencing sustained automatic fire in multiple locations, all attributed to the same American capability. Analysts struggled to reconcile the reports. The locations did not align. The units involved had never been near one another. Yet the descriptions were nearly identical. Somewhere between those contradictions, the endless storm stopped being a place and became an idea. German troops began reacting not to weapons, but to sounds. Slow, steady automatic fire triggered hesitation. Movements were delayed. Routes were altered. Small decisions accumulated into lost momentum. This was not planned. No one on the American side intended it. But once fear takes hold, intention becomes irrelevant. If you have ever wondered how myths are born in combat, now is the time to subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends. And let us know where you are watching from. The battlefield was global, and so is the memory of it. By the time German command realized something was wrong, the front had shifted. The reports no longer described a single engagement. They described a pattern, and patterns demand responses. Heavier weapons were requested for positions that no longer existed. Units were reassigned to counter threats that were already gone. Time was spent preparing for a storm that could not be located, and all of it traced back to a moment in a fog-filled village where a weapon never meant to be special had refused to fall silent when it was supposed to. The irony would only become clear later, because the endless storm was never a weapon. It was a pause that never came. And in war, that can be more dangerous than fire itself. By the time German intelligence officers began trying to map the reports, the war had already moved on. Front lines shifted faster than paperwork. Villages changed hands. Units were pulled back, rotated, or destroyed. Yet the same phrase kept resurfacing in intercepted chatter and delayed summaries, always detached from a fixed point on the map. Endless storm. It appeared in references to firefights that lasted only seconds. It surfaced in accounts where no American heavy weapons were later found. It showed up attached to fear more than fact. Each time, it described the same thing: automatic fire that did not behave as expected. Fire that felt patient. Fire that seemed to wait. German commanders did not believe in ghosts, but they believed in patterns. And the pattern unsettled them. What they could not know was that the original grease gun never left the rubble of that first village. It lay twisted beneath brick and dust, its thin stamped receiver warped by heat and impact. It was useless now. Silent. Forgotten. No one recorded its serial number. No one filed a report. It disappeared the way thousands of small objects disappear in war, erased by larger movements. And yet, its echo remained. German infantry units began reacting not to contact, but to possibility. A single burst of slow, steady fire was enough to trigger caution. Squads halted sooner. Probes were cut short. Orders were questioned. Each reaction made sense on its own. Together, they reshaped behavior across sections of the front. Fear had become portable. This was the second twist of the story, though no one recognized it at the time. The endless storm was no longer tied to a man, a weapon, or even a place. It had become a shared expectation, a rumor that changed decisions before bullets did. From the American side, none of this was visible. The patrol that had survived the village was broken up within weeks. Men were reassigned. Some were wounded. Some were killed. The gunner himself blended back into the machinery of the war, carrying no sense that he had done anything unusual. He had fired when he needed to fire. He had moved when he needed to move. That was all. History rarely pauses to explain how influence works at ground level. Later, long after the fighting moved east, analysts would struggle to reconcile German reports that spoke of sustained American automatic fire in places where no such weapons had ever been deployed. The paperwork did not agree with the terrain. The terrain did not agree with the casualty figures. The only constant was the language. Uninterrupted, relentless, endless. What those reports were really documenting was not a weapon system, but a failure of expectation. German doctrine depended on counting rounds, counting pauses, counting the seconds between sound and silence. When those pauses did not arrive, the system hesitated. And hesitation is lethal in war. There is a quiet irony in that. The M3 grease gun was designed to be cheap, simple, and replaceable. It was never meant to inspire confidence, let alone fear. Engineers did not intend it to change how the enemy thought. Yet for a brief stretch of time, it did exactly that, not because of its design, but because of how it was perceived. This is where the story closes its circle. At the beginning, there was fog, uncertainty, and a sound that refused to end. At the end, there is silence and an absence no one can fully explain. Somewhere beneath rubble near the German border, a useless piece of stamped steel rests, indistinguishable from debris. It will never fire again, but the decisions it influenced cannot be traced so easily. History remembers generals, divisions, and battles with names. It rarely remembers the moment when a single expectation failed, and fear filled the gap. It rarely remembers how a pause that should have happened did not. That is why this story matters. Not because of the grease gun itself, but because it reveals how fragile certainty can be under pressure. How quickly belief outruns reality. How wars are shaped not only by firepower, but by what soldiers think they are facing. The endless storm was never real in the way the Germans imagined it. And yet, for them, it was real enough to change behavior. Real enough to slow advances. Real enough to buy time for people who needed it. And that may be the most unsettling part of all. Because if fear can be carried this easily, if a story can move faster than a weapon, then the true battlefield extends far beyond the range of any gun. If stories like this help you see the war differently, consider subscribing to WW2 Frontline Legends. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from around the world. These moments were small, forgotten, and undocumented, but together they shaped history in ways no map can show. And somewhere, beneath layers of broken stone, the gun that started it all remains exactly where it fell, silent and still unanswered.